Hello. Today I am very pleased to bring before you some ethical conceptions. To human being, ethical conceptions are very, very important. Ethics is a branch of philosophy. Philosophy deals with a number of things. It is greatly interested in discovering what is the nature of ultimate reality. It studies the various metaphysical substances such as God, good, time, space and everything. But all the metaphysical substances are not the only consideration of philosophers. Philosophers are also are interested in what is the human life, what is the meaning of human existence, and how men ought to behave. When they see how men ought to behave, they have certain approaches towards that. Ethics studies how men ought to behave. Ethics is not an objective science. Ethics is a normative science. There are two types of sciences. One is the objective science and the second is the normative science. Let us consider what is an objective science. An objective science is a science which studies what is the case. For example, all the natural sciences are objective sciences. Physics, chemistry, biology, microbiology, anything, all those sciences which deal with some part of nature, they are objective sciences. For example, a genetic engineering wants to understand what is the nature of gene, what is the plan, what is the design, how it works, how a gene works. He is not concerned with how a gene ought to work, but how a gene actually works. If he is an astronomer, he wants to study planets. He wants to study planets means he wants to study what exactly is the case with the planets, how they move, how they rotate, what is their direction and so on. They are concerned with the objective study of the planets. So, there are some sciences which are objective sciences. If I ask, is moral science an objective science? The answer is no. Moral science or ethics as it is called is not an objective science, but a normative science. A normative science is a science which is the study of art. Means an objective science is the study of what is the isness, and moral science is the science of what ought to be the case. What are the different examples of normative sciences? Normative sciences are ethics, logic and moral philosophy. Logic, for example, is the science of how man ought to reason. A logician does not think of how man actually thinks or reasons, but how he ought to reason, what ought to be the laws he has to perform while reasoning. He will think of how to make an argument, what according to what are the rules of argumentation and so on. If he is an aesthetician, it is also a normative science. An aesthetician would think of what are the rules of beauty, what are the rules of creation, how a creation or an art of object ought to be. Thus, aesthetics and logic are the normative sciences. Likewise, ethics or moral philosophy is also a normative science. There is also another part in philosophy which is called as epistemology. Epistemology is the science of the theory of knowledge. It asks questions regarding how do we know. That is the study of epistemology. There is another important branch of philosophy which is called as ethics or moral philosophy. Ethics or moral philosophy is interested in studying human conduct. Conduct is a very special term. Conduct is a term which is used only in the human context. We do not use it in the context of other animals, the rest of the animals than man. When a tiger is hungry and eats a hunt and kills a hunt and eats it up, we do not say it is right or wrong, good or bad, because it just satisfies its hunger. Likewise, we can say that those animals which are just instinctive and impulsive, they go on satisfying their physical wants and they are satisfied. And you will find that in those animals there is no moral consciousness, moral awareness. They never think, they never reflect whether what they have done is good or bad, right or wrong. It is only with the case of man that man thinks what he is doing is good or bad, right or wrong. The term good is very important and it is very specifically used in moral philosophy. Let us see how the term good is used in other ways. If I describe an object as good, let us take an example. This car is good. Means what? This car is very comfortable, it runs very smooth, its machine is very nice, and so on. That is the description of the term good. On the other hand, if I say that this food is good, what does it mean? It means that it is very tasty, it is delicious, and it has nourishment qualities. That is the meaning of good. If I say that the flower is good, it means that its fragrance is good, its form is good, and so on. But now use the term good in the context of human action. If I say that your action of duty is good, it does not mean that there is a physical quality that is good. In case of car, yes. In case of food, yes, that there is a physical quality which is described as good. But in case of human action, for example, duty, when it is called as good, it does not mean that there is some physical quality, but that is a moral quality. So, ethics is the study of conduct, means ethics is the study of the good and bad, the right and wrong of human action. It wants to study according to what rules man behaves. But again we must be consciously aware that behavior is a term which is distinct from the term conduct. Behavior is a term which is used in psychology. Psychology studies how a man learns, how a man emotively acts, how a man does this and that. That is the actual study, the objective study, that is called as the study of behavior. In ethics, there is not the study of behavior, but there is the study of human conduct, how a man ought to behave. Now, the important question for all the moral philosopher is how to decide good, the ultimate end. What ought to be the end of action? What ought to be the goal, the objective of action? So, there are two answers to this question. There are some rationalists, they believe that reason is the moral authority. For example, Immanuel Kant was a staunch rationalist who believed that reason is the supreme thing. He will give you the idea of what is good, what is bad, what is right, what is wrong. He was the philosopher known as a rationalist philosopher, a staunch rationalist philosopher. He believed that in every man there is the good will, and good will is the spring of all human values. All the moral orders are issued from the good will. For example, treat in thine own or that of others always as an end and never as a means. That is the rule of reason, and that is universal, whether he be a Christian or Hindu or Buddhist or Muslim. There are some universal laws of human conduct, the law of duty for example. But there are some philosophers who do not believe in this. They point out the fact of what? The fact of human action. Each action of man is towards some kind of pain, some kind of pleasure or happiness. Why do I eat? Why do I drink? Why do I sleep? Why do I do this and that? I do all these things, or every man does all his actions because those actions in return bring him some kind of pleasure. So, pleasure is the end of life, happiness is the end of life. They are using the term pleasure and happiness as in the equal sense. Here the term pleasure is the physical pleasure, it is a physical quality. I get pleasure from eating or drinking or sleeping or playing because I get some kind of happiness or pleasure from that act. So, there were some philosophers, for example, Butler, Sidgwick and Jeremy Bentham. They propounded this theory that each one seeks his own pleasure, then therefore one ought to seek one's pleasure. Means the proposition is that each one seeks his own pleasure, and on the basis of this proposition they derive a conclusion that one ought to seek one's pleasure. It is wonderful to note that the basic is the fact and the conclusion is an ought. Actually the thing is, ought cannot be derived from is. Ought is a different thing and is a different thing. Jeremy Bentham and Sidgwick and Butler, they were called as psychological hedonists. Psychological hedonists has wonderfully given a hedonistic calculus, means how to measure pleasure. For example, they have given some points as regards how to measure pleasure. For example, propinquity means nearness. If I am getting pleasure in a short way or in a long way, that is the measure. When I get it by nearest way, it is more pleasurable to me. The another is the fecundity. The fecundity means the power to produce more pleasure or the power to produce other pleasure. Suppose there are acts A, B and C. From act A, from act B, from act C, I am getting pleasure. So, if B act gives me more pleasures than A, and if C act gives me more and more pleasure than A and B, then C I should choose. That is the measure of called as fecundity. So, there are some other facets also. Longness or nearness in time. If suppose from A I am getting pleasure in a short time and from B I am getting pleasure for a long time or after a long time, then I should choose the pleasure which will give me in a short time. So, this is the fantastic calculation, hedonistic calculation. This hedonistic calculation and the idea of pleasure was greatly attacked by the rationalists. This is just an empirical standpoint to look at human life. Actually, the human life is far different because it is rational, moral, there is a moral consciousness. What one ought to do is that one ought to seek one's own pleasure is not true, because if you go on seeking your own pleasure, the pleasure is not really a durable thing. It is finished within a moment or so, or it is a temporary, and again you go on pursuing the pleasure and you derive pain from that. So, pleasure is so called a thing, not a permanent thing, not a virtue, not a value. So, egoistic hedonism as says that I should seek my own pleasure, each one should seek own pleasure. This is the egoistic psychological hedonism. This was greatly attacked. In order to save this, there came forward one more philosopher called as John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill was of the opinion that pleasure or happiness is the most desirable thing. He said, in order to defend the psychological hedonism, he called his hedonism as ethical hedonism or universalistic hedonism. How is man placed in the nature? Man is placed in the nature in such a way that he should always ought to seek one kind of pleasure, some kind of pleasure, and he should seek the pleasure of the greatest number, not of his own only, but the pleasure of others also. The greatest happiness of the greatest number is the motto or is the idea of John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill's philosophy is also called as utilitarianism or universalistic hedonism. Now, universalistic hedonism of John Stuart Mill has certain points. He says that pleasure is desirable and therefore it is art. But this is wrong, my friends, because the term desirable is not used in a proper way. It is not a term like audible or visible. Audible means that which is to be seen, or audible means that which is to be heard, and visible means that which is to be seen. But desirable does not mean like that. Desirable is a different concept altogether, different from visible and audible. And therefore, he commits a great mistake in using the term desirable. Secondly, he says that there is a qualitative difference in among pleasures. One pleasure might be qualitatively different from the other pleasure, and the third pleasure may be more again qualitatively different from the previous two. He goes on maintaining that particular view. But the thing is that he is maintaining a wrong view. If there are qualitative differences among pleasure, then pleasure cannot be called as a norm, because it is not fixed. It would be very relative what kind of pleasure it is, and whether it is more or less is not an important thing. Another important thing about Mill is that Mill says, in order to save the psychological hedonism and egoistic hedonism, he said that mine is a universalistic hedonism. Each one ought to seek one's own pleasure and also should seek the pleasure of others, and there would be an addition of the pleasures, my pleasure and your pleasure and his pleasure and her pleasure. There would be a great sum of pleasure. This is just a fallacious idea. Pleasures cannot be summed up, pleasures cannot be added, just for the reason that my pleasure is strictly my own pleasure. It can never be your pleasure, and your pleasure can never be my pleasure, but your own pleasure. That means pleasures cannot be added, and the greatest happiness of the greatest number cannot be there. So, he commits a fallacy which is called as a composite fallacy, or the fallacy of composition. For example, in a battalion or in a platoon, there are 10 soldiers, and the height of each soldier is 5 feet and 2 inches. Then what will be the general height, the total height of the 5 into 5 inches, 5 feet 2 inches into 10 would be the greatest height, but that is really not the height, because each one soldier has his own height and height cannot be added. Likewise, pleasures cannot be added. This was therefore a wrong conception of pleasure. Ultimately, when we go for examining the whole theory, what do we see? We see that the theory of hedonism is just an empirical theory. An empirical theory cannot be a normative theory. An empirical theory, an objective theory, which will stand some facts, which may stand for some facts, but may not stand for some ideas. Ethics or moral philosophy has to attain some values or some virtues. This has not been done in utilitarianism or universalistic hedonism. Another and lastly, the most important point is that he says that pleasure is desirable. Actually, what happens is that pleasure is merely an accompanying phenomenon. When I strive for an object, what I really want is the satisfaction of some of my want, and not the pleasure. Pleasure just is accompanied. It may come or it may not come. Suppose for I am too hungry and I do not get the pleasure, I do not get the food which I want, then I have to satisfy my hunger with any kind of food, and that is enough for me. I may derive some pleasure or not. So, pleasure is really not the real phenomenon, and even if it is a real phenomenon, it has no moral standing, it has no moral virtue. So, you will find that John Stuart Mill and Bentham and Butler and Sidgwick were maintaining a wrong view regarding moral principles. The most wonderful thing to note is that Immanuel Kant, who was a staunch rationalist, has maintained a view that reason alone is the supreme authority. Reason alone is the greatest authority in the moral field. It is reason that makes no mistake in giving you the proper guidance as regards what is right, what is good. For example, duty for the sake of duty is the important thing, and when you are performing a duty, it is not for the sake of some kind of pleasure, it is duty in itself. Thus you will find that rationalists like Immanuel Kant propounds a theory which is far better than the empirical naturalistic theory called as hedonism. Thank you very much.